They said no fence could stop a Wyoming blizzard. Garrett Holden built one anyway, a strange zigzag pattern of wooden slats that his neighbors called the ugliest thing ever hammered into frozen ground. While other ranchers reinforced barn doors and stacked hay against walls, Garrett spent 3 weeks constructing something that looked more like modern art than livestock protection. The night the temperature plunged to 40 below and winds hit 60 miles per hour, 23 calves huddled behind that ridiculous fence while the storm erased everything else from sight. By morning, ranchers across 3 counties were counting their dead. Garrett Holden was counting calves that should not have survived and wondering how to explain what he had done. The fence nobody understood. Garrett Holden drove the first post in a frozen Wyoming ground 3 weeks before the storm that would change everything. The soil fought him with every swing of the post driver, frozen solid 2 feet down, but he kept working through the resistance with the patience of a man who understood that preparation mattered more than comfort. His breath came out in white clouds that the wind shredded instantly, carrying them across the empty pasture toward mountains that had already turned white with early snow. The design he followed came from old agricultural research he had found in University Extension Bulletin from the 1950s. Snow fences, the document explained, worked not by blocking wind entirely, but by disrupting it. The key was porosity, gaps between the slats that allowed air to pass through while creating turbulence on the lee side. That turbulence caused snow to drop out of the wind stream in predictable patterns, building drifts in controlled locations rather than letting them form wherever the storm decided. Most ranchers used snow fences along roads to prevent drifting across highways. Garrett intended to use the same principle to create a protected zone for his calves, a wind shadow where temperatures would stay higher and snow accumulation would remain manageable. The zigzag pattern he had designed would multiply the effect, each section creating its own turbulence zone, the angles calculated to handle winds from the northwest, where Wyoming storms typically originated. Dalton Marsh stopped his truck on the county road the 4th day of construction. He sat watching for nearly 10 minutes before finally walking across the frozen pasture to where Garrett was measuring distances between posts. Dalton owned the largest ranch in the valley, ran over 1,000 head of cattle, and had opinions about everything that happened within 50 miles of his property. Garrett kept working as Dalton approached, spacing the next post exactly 12 feet from the previous one, checking his angles against the compass reading he had marked on his planning sheet. Dalton stood with his arms crossed, studying the partially completed structure with an expression that mixed confusion with something that looked like pity. He asked what exactly Garrett thought he was building. Garrett explained the concept briefly. Wind disruption, snow deposition, protected microclimate for vulnerable calves. He mentioned the research, the calculations, the way highway departments had used similar principles for decades. Dalton listened without interrupting, then shook his head slowly. He told Garrett that highway snow fences were 8 feet tall and ran for miles. This thing looked like a drunk carpenter had tried to build a corral and given up halfway through. He said the first real wind would knock it flat, and even if it stayed standing, no fence made of wooden slats was going to keep calves warm in a Wyoming winter. Garrett did not argue. He had learned years ago that arguing with certain men only hardened their positions. He simply thanked Dalton for his concern and went back to measuring. Word spread quickly through the ranching community. By the end of the first week, Garrett had become a source of entertainment for people who needed something to discuss during the long winter evenings. The jokes were not cruel exactly, but they carried an edge of superiority that came from generations of doing things a particular way and seeing no reason to change. Cora watched her husband work from the kitchen window each evening, seeing him return exhausted and frozen, his hands cracked from the cold despite heavy gloves. She did not ask if he was certain about the design. She had been married to Garrett for 19 years and understood that his certainty came from careful thought rather than stubborn pride. When he committed to something, he had already considered the alternatives and found them wanting. The fence took shape slowly across the north pasture, its zigzag pattern creating angles that caught the afternoon light in ways that did look strange, almost artistic. Garrett had calculated each section to be 60% porous, the ratio that research suggested was optimal for snow deposition. The slats were spaced with gaps that allowed wind through, while still creating enough disruption to drop snow on the windward side rather than letting it drift freely across the pasture. 23 calves grazed in that pasture, born late in the season and still too young to handle extreme cold without protection. The barn was too small to hold them all, and Garrett had watched too many calves die in overcrowded barns where disease spread faster than warmth could accumulate. His fence was a gamble, but it was a calculated one based on physics rather than hope. 3 days before the storm hit, Garrett finished the final section. The completed structure stretched 400 feet across the north pasture in a pattern that resembled nothing any of his neighbors had ever seen. It stood 6 feet tall, angled in 5 distinct sections, each one positioned to create overlapping wind shadows that would theoretically protect anything sheltering behind them. Dalton Marsh drove past that evening and stopped again, this time bringing 2 other ranchers to see what Garrett had built. They stood at the fence line, shaking their heads and laughing at something one of them said. Garrett watched from his porch, feeling the weight of their judgment, but also feeling something else. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily for 2 days, and the clouds building over the mountains carried a darkness that promised something worse than ordinary winter weather. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, either his fence would work or it would not. There was nothing left to do but wait. When the sky turned white, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 6 hours. Garrett stood at his kitchen window at 3 in the morning, watching the thermometer fall past 20 below and continue dropping with no sign of stopping. The wind had shifted during the night, coming now from exactly the direction he had predicted, driving against his fence with a sound like continuous thunder. The Weather Service had issued their most severe warning. Historic cold, they said, combined with sustained winds that would create conditions unsurvivable for exposed livestock. Ranchers were advised to shelter all animals and prepare for extended power outages. The tone in the announcer's voice carried something beyond professional concern, something that sounded almost like fear. Garrett had moved his 23 calves into the protected zone behind the fence the previous afternoon, positioning them in the area where his calculations suggested the wind shadow would be strongest. He had spread extra bedding straw in that section and positioned hay bales as additional windbreaks within the larger protected area. The calves had settled there willingly, their instincts apparently recognizing shelter even when it took an unfamiliar form. Cora brought coffee and stood beside him at the window. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the world was disappearing behind walls of white that made it impossible to see the fence, the pasture, or anything beyond the porch steps. The house groaned under wind gusts that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The phone rang at 5. Dalton Marsh's voice came through rough and strained, asking if Garrett's calves were still in that north pasture. Garrett confirmed they were. Dalton went quiet for a moment, then said his barn roof was taking damage from snow accumulation, that he had 40 calves in there and was worried about collapse. He asked if Garrett had room in his barn for overflow if things got worse. Garrett explained his barn was empty, that all his calves were behind the fence. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Garrett thought the connection had failed. Dalton finally spoke again, his voice carrying disbelief. He said Garrett had left 23 calves outside in this weather, protected by nothing but wooden slats and empty space. He said that was not innovative, that was insane, and those animals would be frozen solid by morning. The line went dead before Garrett could respond. More calls came as the morning progressed. Vernon Hatch reported he had lost power and his heated barn was cooling rapidly. Marcus Cole said 3 of his calves had already died despite being sheltered, the cold simply too extreme for their young bodies to handle. The emergency frequency crackled with reports of livestock losses mounting across the county, numbers climbing with each update. Garrett listened to the reports and thought about his calves behind the fence, invisible somewhere in that white chaos. He had done the calculations, had trusted the physics, had built the structure according to principles that worked for highway departments across the northern plains. But calculations on paper and living animals in a historic blizzard were different things entirely. The wind reached 62 miles per hour by midday, gusts that shook the house hard enough to rattle dishes in the cupboards. Cora found Garrett standing at the window again, his coffee cold in his hands, his eyes fixed on the direction of the north pasture, as if he could see through the blinding white if he just looked hard enough. She asked if he wanted to try reaching the calves, and he shook his head. Going out in these conditions would be suicide, and even if he reached them, there was nothing he could do. Either the fence was creating the wind shadow he had designed, or it was not. Either the calves were surviving in a protected microclimate, or they were freezing in an exposed pasture while he stood helpless in his kitchen. The storm raged for 14 hours straight. Garrett tried to sleep and could not, his mind running through calculations he had already checked 100 times, wondering if he had missed something, if some variable he had not considered was killing his animals while he waited. When the wind finally began to ease near midnight, the silence it left behind felt almost as violent as the noise had been. Garrett stood at the window and watched the snow settle, watched the world slowly become visible again, and felt his stomach clench with the weight of not knowing what morning would reveal. The morning after, dawn came gray and still, the storm's fury spent, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Drifts reached second-story windows in places, buried fences and outbuildings under smooth white curves that gave no hint of what lay beneath. The thermometer read 31 below zero, cold enough that the snow squeaked under Garrett's boots like compressed styrofoam as he made his way toward the north pasture. The walk took 40 minutes through drifts that came up past his waist in places. He carried a shovel, but barely used it, choosing instead to push through the snow with the desperate energy of a man who needed answers more than he needed to conserve strength. His lungs burned with each breath of frozen air, but he kept moving, kept pushing toward the fence he could not yet see. He spotted the first section from 50 yards away, and what he saw made him stop completely. The fence was still standing, every post upright, every slat intact. But more importantly, the snow pattern around it matched his calculations almost exactly. On the windward side, a massive drift had formed, snow piled 8 feet high against the fence and extending 30 feet back toward the direction the wind had come from. On the lee side, where his calves should have been, the snow was measured in inches rather than feet. Garrett broke into a stumbling run, fighting through the final stretch of deep snow until he reached the protected zone behind the fence. The area was exactly as he had hoped. Wind shadow had kept accumulation minimal, and the calves had huddled together in the sheltered space, their combined body heat creating a microclimate that had kept them alive through conditions that killed livestock across 3 counties. 23 calves lifted their heads as he approached. 23 sets of eyes watching him with the calm alertness of animals that had spent an uncomfortable but survivable night. The smallest calf, a heifer he had worried about most, stood and stretched before walking over to investigate his pockets for treats. Garrett knelt in the shallow snow, running his hands over warm bodies, checking temperatures and breathing and all the vital signs that told him these animals were not just alive, but healthy. The fence had worked. The physics had held. The ridiculous structure that everyone had mocked had created exactly the protection he had designed it to create. He stayed with the calves for an hour, feeding them grain he had carried in his pack, checking each one individually. When he finally turned back toward the house, he saw a truck parked in his driveway, a figure standing beside it watching him across the white expanse of the pasture. Dalton Marsh waited without speaking as Garrett made the long walk back. His face showed exhaustion and something else, something that looked like it might break if he tried to put it into words. Garrett stopped a few feet away, pulling frozen fabric from his face so he could speak clearly. He told Dalton the calves were alive. All 23. Dalton nodded slowly, his jaw working. He said he had lost 19. 19 calves dead in a barn that was supposed to protect them, crushed when the roof partially collapsed under snow weight, or frozen in sections where the walls could not keep out the cold. He said he had come to see if the fence had actually worked because if it had, he needed to understand how. Garrett led him to the north pasture, showed him the drift pattern on the windward side, explained how the porosity of the fence slowed the wind enough to drop snow before it reached the protected zone. He described the wind shadow effect, the way disrupted airflow created a pocket of relatively calm air where temperature stayed higher and snow accumulation stayed lower. Dalton listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from the fence to the calves to the snow patterns that proved everything Garrett was saying. When Garrett finished, Dalton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Garrett would remember for the rest of his life. He said that 19 calves were dead because he had been too certain that he already knew everything worth knowing. He said ridiculous was just a word people used for things they had not bothered to understand. What ridiculous became. The county agricultural meeting happened 3 weeks after the storm, and for the first time anyone could remember, there were not enough chairs for everyone who wanted to attend. Ranchers came from 4 counties, some driving hours through roads that were still being cleared. All of them wanted to hear about the fence that had saved 23 calves when traditional methods had failed across the entire region. Garrett stood at the front of the room with diagrams he had drawn by hand, explaining wind dynamics and snow deposition patterns and the mathematics of porosity ratios. He talked about the research from the 1950s, about highway department applications, about the simple principle that disrupting wind was more effective than trying to block it entirely. The questions lasted 2 hours. Men who had lost stock wanted to know every detail, wanted measurements and angles and spacing calculations, wanted to understand how something so simple had accomplished what their expensive barns and heated shelters could not. Dalton Marsh spoke near the end of the meeting, standing before the assembled ranchers and admitting publicly that he had mocked Garrett's fence, that he had called it ridiculous and predicted failure. He told them about his 19 dead calves and about the moment he saw Garrett's animals alive and healthy behind wooden slats and empty space. He said innovation did not care about tradition, that what worked mattered more than what had always been done. The spring that followed brought more snow fences across Wyoming than the previous decade combined. Garrett helped neighbors build modified versions of his design, adjusting angles and lengths for different terrain and different wind patterns. He answered letters from ranchers in Montana and Colorado and Nebraska, sharing his calculations freely with anyone who asked. Cora hung a photograph on their kitchen wall, showing the fence standing against white sky with the protected zone visible behind it. Below the image, she had written words that captured everything that had happened. Sometimes the ridiculous is just the obvious waiting for someone brave enough to try. Garrett saw it every morning and thought about the weight of being certain when everyone said he was wrong. He thought about 23 calves that had survived because he trusted physics over tradition. He thought about Dalton Marsh, who had become an unlikely ally, now building snow fences across his own property and advocating for the technique at every opportunity. The next winter would bring more storms, but it would also bring more fences, more ranchers willing to try something different, more calves that would live because one man had been willing to build something everyone called stupid until it saved lives. That was enough. That was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale.